Dr. Curnutt. I'm the chair of the English department. And it's been my pleasure for about the last 10 years to help run the Hall Waters Prize, which is a prize that our English department awards every year to a significant author of Southern origins that has made a significant contribution to literature. And this is the first time we're able to have this award on campus in 3 years. So we thought we would try to do something different this year. And since I teach the capstone course in English, which is senior seminar, I walked into our first class and said to all of these wonderful 15 students of mine, you're going to organize this event and you're going to run it. And they all dropped the class the next day. No. They stuck around, and I really want to emphasize to you that this is just what a great batch of students these are, and they've done a phenomenal job pulling together an entire day on Troy for our guest. So before I introduce our recipient, I want to introduce you to the 4 students who are going to be our interviewers for this particular segment of the day. And so here in order, we have Cece Cooper and Megan Lawrence, Ellie Russell, and Laura White. And they've all come up with questions after reading all of our recipients' books. So without further ado, I would like to welcome up our 2022 recipient of the Hall Waters Prize. Before I introduce her, just real quick, let me introduce Mr. Swam. Greg, can you stand up just for a second? Mr. Swam here is represents the estate of Dr. Wade Hall, who was a student at Troy when it was called Troy State College. And he used to tell me many stories of riding the train from Montgomery to go to class. And he did not have to pay parking fees. So that's something to think about. But we're delighted to have Mr. Swam, who's an integral part of the process of awarding this every year. Our 2022 recipient of the Hall Waters Prize is Michelle Richmond, who is the author of 8 books, 6 of which are novels, and several of which are New York Times bestsellers. She's probably best known for The Year of Fog, which came out in 2007, and then her 2 most recent books, which I think have catapulted her to a new level of visibility. There is the Marriage Pact, which came out in 2017, and then last year, a novel called The Wonder Test. These are all books that have been published by Random House, which is one of the major publishers in the United States. And Michelle, we decided we wanted to give it to Michelle for a few reasons. First and foremost, she is a wonderful person. I will tell you that she was kind enough to blurb a book that Dr. Chris Schaefer, our Dean of Libraries, did just this year. She corresponds with many of the folks on this campus, including General Walter Gavon. And she's a good friend of mine. We happened to appear in an anthology together about a year ago, and I have no problem telling you her story is way better than mine. So, but Michelle is also a phenomenal writer, and she's had a very interesting career. And one of the things that we like to do with this award is to celebrate writers that maybe haven't gotten the fame that they've deserved, although she is a bestseller, but at the same time, writers who've managed to sustain a career, which is very hard in the publishing industry in this day and age. So without further ado, I would like to invite to the podium Miss Michelle Richmond. She's going to make a few remarks, and then the students are going to ask questions. So.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Kirk, and thank you all for being here, and to all the teachers who gave you extra credit for being here. And I also want to thank the English department, Troy University, Mr. Swim, and the students who put this event together. This is amazing, and I'm so happy to be back in Alabama for this, and also happy to be part of this group of writers and musicians and songwriters who have received this award. It means the world to me. And so I thought I would just read for about 5 minutes, and I was trying to, before we start our conversation, I was trying to figure out this morning what to read. And I thought, well, since I'm coming home to Alabama, maybe I'll read a brief coming home to Alabama. I won't read the whole story, but I'll read a piece of a coming home to Alabama story. And I often, when I travel, whether I'm traveling far away or traveling domestically or even just down the road from where I live, when I come home, I end up writing a story about that place. So I think this story came from a trip down to Mobile and Fairhope several years ago or many years ago for a literary event. So I'll just read a piece of it. It's called Scales. Before we met, he had passed a decade of bachelorhood in a small house in Fairhope, just steps from Mobile Bay, with the aid of a trusted assistant who did his shopping, ran his errands, and occasionally shared his meals. And then he found me, or it should be said, I found him, on the Fairhope Pier on a typically moonlit night. He appeared to me first as a statuesque figure at the end of the pier, dressed in a long-sleeved shirt and linen pants. I was having a difficult time of it, having recently lost, within the span of a few weeks, a decent job and a beloved pet, not to mention a boyfriend, when I saw him standing there, so still and silent he did not seem real. I stepped off the warm sand onto the pier. When the boards creaked beneath me, he turned, and only then did I understand that this splendid creature was alive. For several moments, I hesitated. Someone standing in such a way at such a place on such a night surely does not want to be interrupted. Then the moonlight hit his face, and a flash of multicolored light shot off the tip of his elegant nose, and I found myself walking toward him as the old pier wobbled and groaned. "Stop," he called out. It was a scratchy voice, halting, as if it was out of practice. "Why?" I called back. "Because," was his reply. "It's a public pier," I argued. To this he had no answer. He turned back toward the water and took a step. For a moment I thought he might jump, but he didn't. When I reached him, he kept his back to me and muttered, "I came out here to be alone." "Me too, I won't bother you." Then I moved to stand beside him, and he lifted a gloved hand to shield his face. "Please," he said, but by then I had already seen. We stood for a moment or two in silence before I said the only thing I could think of to say, which was, "You're beautiful." "I'm ghastly," he replied. "Not to me." He produced a small bag, and when he opened it, I could smell hot spice and salt in the sea. It was a strong, wonderful odor particular to the Gulf Coast, and immediately I was happy to be home again after a long time away. "Crawfish," he said, "I know." I reached into the bag, took one of the hard little shells, and twisted until the tail came clean from the head. I sucked the head, something I hadn't done in years, but the juice was delicious, even more than I remembered, tangy and sweet. The shimmering man followed suit, and it occurred to me that the boyfriend who had just kicked me out of his stylish apartment in the stylish city that had never really felt like home would never have done such a thing. I squeezed the tail into the shell until the tender pink meat came out and popped it into my mouth. Only then did I have the good grace to thank him. "Thank you," he said. "No one should ever eat crawfish alone. I've been doing it far too long." The combination of the words and the way he looked at me as if we were complicit in some dream of love seemed to cast forward to a future when we would do this together frequently, would in fact do many things together. It would not be an exaggeration to say that at that moment I understood that the thing we were going to share together would be nothing short of a life. And it goes on, but I'm going to end there. Thank you.
So first question. I want to start by asking you about your recent novel, The Wonder Test. Fun fact, our whole class got copies of the book and we all got to read it. It's a great read. So something that we were kind of wondering is if the college admission scandal of 2019 impacted or inspired the plot of your novel at all, and also what inspired you to begin each chapter with a question that would be on the Wonder Test.
Oh, okay. So the Wonder Test takes place in Silicon Valley near where I live, and it's the title comes from a high-stakes test, fictionalized, that the students take in 10th grade. And the school is supposed to get the best scores in the country every year. And the funny thing is, when I wrote this, the testing scandal the college admissions scandal had not happened yet. And that scandal broke about 6 months before the book came out, I think. And so the publicity for the book, then a lot of people were talking about this book being about that, but it wasn't. But oddly enough, someone from my town, my small town in California, was convicted of he was one of the parents who wisely decided to pay for his kid to get into college under false pretenses. So it wasn't based on that, but it was sort of the right time. It was sort of the right timing for it anyway. And I'm sorry, what was your second question?
And then the other part of the question was, what inspired you to begin each of the chapters with a question that would be on the Wonder Test?
Oh, okay. So yeah, every chapter has a question, and I got a lot of emails after the book came out saying, well, I couldn't figure out the answer to this question. And that's because there aren't any. The questions are completely absurd. And I just kind of wanted a structure for the book, but I also wanted to have fun with these questions that the students would have to answer. And I'll tell you honestly where that came from is I started thinking about this book when my son was in elementary school. And we used to sit at the dinner table, my husband and my son and me, and we would just be trying to figure out his worksheets, and we'd be laughing. And so our family joke was, what is the circumference of Brown? Because it seemed like every question, like there was no answer. Like there is no circumference of Brown, but our little third grader was supposed to figure that out. And so it was just kind of going off of this idea of the absurdity of these standardized testing questions.
Awesome. Thank you.
We wanted to know, what was the inspiration behind the FBI agent Lena Connerly, and do you plan for her to appear in any future novels?
Yes, thank you for that question. So I have been married to an FBI agent for 20 years, and I've never put an FBI agent in a book. And so he's about to retire after over 25 years in the business, and I thought, well, it's time. I can finally write about an FBI agent. So, and I also felt, Lena Connerly is the first. Yes, there will be others. So currently the idea is three books featuring FBI agent Lena Connerly. But what I wanted to do was show what that life is really like, and show sort of the toll it takes on the toll that the FBI life takes on a family, and how unglamorous the work is. And Agent Connerly is in she's in counterintelligence for the FBI, which is what has been sort of the background noise of my life for most of my adult life. So that's where she came from. Yeah.
Hi. So you mentioned that the Wonder Test is set in California,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of us noticed reading your novels that setting is so important and almost feels like its own character.
Yeah.
So how is writing about California different than about the South?
Oh, I've never gotten that question before. Thank you for that question. That's interesting, and I have to think about it for a minute. And I think my first novel with a California setting was The Year of Fog, and I had moved to San Francisco and was living in the Outer Avenues. And anyone who's been to San Francisco, and especially the Outer Avenues, knows that those beaches are very different from Alabama and Gulf Coast beaches. It's cold, it's windy, it's foggy. And so The Year of Fog was really sort of a love letter to San Francisco. It was so much about that landscape, but my love of the water came from growing up on the Gulf Coast. And my family took a trip to San Francisco when I was 13, and I decided I'm going to live in San Francisco. And so the first guy I met from San Francisco, I actually hitched myself to him in graduate school, and that was that. But so I think that, so in that book, even though it's set in San Francisco, the narrator is from Alabama, and in a lot of my books that's the case. So I'm writing about my new home, California, but the character has an Alabama background, or at least a Southern background, but usually Alabama. And I think when I look at the pieces I write about Alabama, whether they're short stories or scenes within a book about somewhere else, there is a more relaxed feel to the Alabama scenes and stories. There's a more leisurely pace to the writing. And I think in the last couple of books, the California I'm writing about is a California that's very different from the one I moved to 20 years ago. It's more competitive, it's more stressful, and there's more of a feeling of the sort of the undertow, the nervous and frightening undertow beneath sort of the shiny facade of California.
Thank you.
Kind of like piggybacking off of that, many of your books feature a displacement of some sort. And I was wondering, does that come from a sense of longing or necessity? And did the move many of your characters make from the South mirror your own move?
Longing or necessity, I like that. I think what the characters experience is what I experience, but what any of you who have moved to here from far away or who will move far away from here, it doesn't even have to be far away, you could move 3 hours away. I think that there's a push-pull. It's like the waves. Like you're always looking back. You're casting back to where you came from, and you're always aware of sort of the meaning of that place and the landscape of that place. And you're also pulled toward your new place, but you're making a new life somewhere very different from your old life, and you're making new friendships and getting your cable and your phone and all that stuff. And so there's this. I think there's the longing for the past, but there's also the pull toward, okay, what is this new life? And of course, then what happens, I've been in California since 1999, your new life becomes your life. And I'm at this point in my life, I'm not going to tell you guys how old I am, but you can guess, where my life is split evenly down the middle between Alabama and California. And I realized that a few months ago, although there was a stint there over the last couple of years in out of the country in France, but it's sort of this even hewing between the two places, and I've never really reconciled it. And I think it, well, I could go on, so I won't. But I think it's an interesting for anyone who moves away from your home. You always long for your home, but also feel that necessity to do something different.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so I know a lot of people in this room we're aspiring authors ourselves. So I have a question about publishing. I don't know about y'all, but I know nothing about publishing. So what has been the biggest change in publishing and the publishing process since you started publishing your novels?
Well, I can tell you that it's possible that it was my second novel, but it was my first sort of big novel, which is called The Year of Fog and was published in 2007 by Random House. I think the Random House that exists right now would not have published that book. And that was a sort of a leisurely book that went back and forth in many ways, plot-wise and the structure of it. I think what has happened is that the publishing industry has moved toward promoting certain genres. I mean, they've always done this. They've always sort of chosen their genres, but now they want the big sales. And so there's more of a push toward thrillers, sci-fi, which I love to read, by the way. And so there's that, but there are also some positive changes. So I just moved from Random House to a wonderful small press called Grove Atlantic with the Wonder Test. So the good thing to know for you, if you are a writer going out into the world, the publishing landscape is going to change rapidly. You're not going to be able to predict what's happening. I couldn't have seen ebooks when I started out, but I also wouldn't have known that ebooks actually for the writer are good. they've turned out to be good for us. But the press I moved to is much smaller, and they just said, well, write what you want. So there are still publishers like that. You just have to figure out how to find your home and where to find it. And my first book was a university press, University of Massachusetts Press. It was a story collection because no major publisher wanted to publish my stories, but University of Massachusetts was a wonderful home for that book. And several years ago, I published my second story collection, and that was also, this was just a joy to me. That was University of Alabama Press, which it was again, to that feeling of homecoming, that my alma mater's press would publish my stories all these years after I had gone to school there. So there's always a home for your writing, and it might be a small publisher, it might be a giant publisher. You might get paid a lot, you might get paid almost nothing. You might get paid almost nothing, and then for some reason your book sells a lot. You can't predict it, the publisher can't predict it, and the royalties are great. Your books might disappear from the shelves within 1 week, and it's all just sort of this ebb and flow. Most writers do have an ebb and flow sort of relationship with publishing, and you just sort of go along with it and just keep writing your best work, no matter what the publishing industry is doing. That was a very long answer to a short question, sorry.
Okay. Kind of piggybacking off of that, did the pressures of these publishers influence your sense of genre and target audience at all, or were you just able to kind of jump to where you felt like you belonged?
Actually, they did influence, because what happened with the Marriage Pact, I had written a book about marriage, and it was about a marriage cult, but it was exploring sort of themes about marriage and control within a marriage, and sort of what is expected of us when we're part of any sort of community, and turned it into my publisher thinking they would market it the way they had marketed my other books. And my editor was salivating. She said, Michelle, you've written a thriller. I said, I don't think I've written a thriller. She said, you have written a thriller. And let's just go ahead and publish it just like this. And I said, okay. And so then she put me through 2 years of edits where she's like just stripping and stripping away to make it more intense and more, in publishing the word is urgency. And so definitely that influenced what that book became, but I ultimately liked what that book became. And that, so in that sense, when you're with a big publishing house, their editorial ideas will influence what you write, not so much you just write what you want to write, but when they get a hold of it, they have their ideas about it, and they also have a publishing calendar. And once you've signed a contract, your book isn't going onto the publishing calendar until they've approved it. So your editor does have some control over the final revision process, but the publisher I'm with now, they kind of don't do that. They do good editorial work, but they're more open to just whatever. You write what you want. Don't think about what genre it is, and then we'll decide what to do with it, which I think more small publishers are doing, and that's a good place to be.
Okay, good to know. Thank you.
Your debut novel was The Dream of the Blue Room in 2003. We wanted to know, what would you say was your biggest lesson that you learned while you were writing a long narrative?
Don't put everything in one book. So Dream of the Blue Room is set half in China and half in Fairhope. And I was living in Beijing at the time, working. I was in my 20s. I thought, I'm in Beijing, I'm going to write a memoir. And I wrote the whole time I was there, and I quickly realized when I got home that I didn't really have anything to write a memoir about, but I had all these notes I had taken and all these experiences in China, and I thought I'll put them in a novel, and I did. And I thought I'm going to put my adolescence into a novel, and I did, which is fine, but then I put a bunch of other stuff into it too. The Three Gorges Dam was being constructed at the time, and since has been completed, and it's a big environmental catastrophe, that's a whole nother subject, but at the time I was fascinated with the Three Gorges Dam, so that all had to go in there. And I think what I realized is you can't put everything in one book. But I still like that book because it was my first novel, and I would do things differently now, but that's why I'm glad I don't have that novel to write now. I'm glad that sort of messy thing came to being at that point in my life.
How do you pick what goes into the novel? What do you think? How do you pick what's most important to go into it?
Well, first of all, I start with, okay, who is this person? Who's this character? What do they do for a living? Because I want to know, like when I'm reading a book, if I don't know how a person is making their way through the world, I get really irritated. So what do they do for a living? And then what's the big problem that they face? And then who is their closest relationship with? And so I know all those things have to go into it. And then in each scene, I know, okay, well, something has to happen to make this scene interesting. And we have to have like, maybe there's 6 bottles of water on the table. Maybe there's a burgundy tablecloth. Maybe there's a white floor, or or maybe there's sort of the sound of the fan in the background. Like I try to give like enough little details, a few details, so you feel grounded, but not so many details that you feel bored. So you write a bunch of stuff and then strip it away, and then I don't know. Like I just write a ton of stuff and then I leave usually tens of thousands of words on the editing room floor when I'm revising it.
All right, thank you.
So you mentioned earlier the collaborative relationship you have with your publisher and a little bit with your editor. What's the role of your agent been like over time from Dream of the Blue Room to now?
So I've been very fortunate with my agent, and I don't know a lot of people have had this experience, but what happened was, so I published my story collection without an agent, and then my second book, Dream of the Blue Room, I did not have an agent. And that was actually just a sort of a serendipity thing. I had come down to Alabama to do an event in Fairhope. I met this guy named Sonny, whom Kirk and I were just talking about a few days ago, or maybe it was Bart and I were just talking about. And I had met, and so I had gone down to Fairhope and I met this guy named Sonny who said, oh, well, I scout for a publisher in San Francisco. Do you have a novel? I said, oh, yeah, I have a novel. And he said, well, send it to me. I'll send it to the San Francisco publisher. So he did, and they published it, but at that point I didn't have an agent. And so after that, then I went out looking for an agent, and I went to, and I got rejected. I got tons of rejections. I still have these letters from lots of agents saying, no, thank you. Come to us later when you have something more to say. And so then I went to Swanee, Tennessee for the Writers Conference down there, and I met with Ann and George Borchardt, who were agents from New York who would go there every year. And I was working on The Year of the Fog at the time, and they read a piece of it and said, send it to us when you're finished. I did send it to them when I was finished. They said, we're going to take you on, but our daughter has just joined the business, Valerie, and we're going to put you with Valerie. And I said, okay. So Valerie then sold The Year of Fog, but first every major publisher rejected the book, and then for over a year, rejection after rejection. And I told Valerie, well, maybe this, maybe I need to go back to the drawing board with this book. And she said, no, I believe in this book. So she found the right editor for the book. She sold the book. That was in 2005, and I've been with her ever since. And when I say it's an unusual relationship, what I mean is that she's my friend and she's my agent, and I would never leave her, and unless she leaves the business, she will never leave me. And what she does is I give her a book when it's finished. She gives me a few notes on it, tells me when she thinks it's ready to send out, and then she does this wonderful thing. She starts sending it out, and she doesn't tell me who's rejecting it. I'll after a while, I'll email her and ask how things are going, and only then will she sort of vaguely allude to rejections. And if I say, well, what are they saying? Then she'll tell me what they're saying, and then she'll say, but don't worry about it. We'll find the right home for this book. And so that's my relationship with my agent, but not everyone has such a great relationship.
That's really amazing. What would be your biggest piece of advice for someone who has a manuscript when it comes to getting an agent, finding an agent?
Well, I'll give you one piece of practical advice, and that is, what are you reading that is similar in genre or in tone to your manuscript? Like, what are you reading that you admire?
find 5 books that you're reading that you really like that share some similarity to your book, and go to the acknowledgments page, find out who the agent is, go on the internet, find the agents, find out how that agent accepts submissions, which is usually just email, and you email them and say, oh, I noticed you represented so and so. I love her books. I have a manuscript. Would it be okay if I send you a query in a couple of chapters, and hopefully then you hear back from them? And so you never ever send a whole manuscript to an agent. You send sort of a cover letter with a little bit about the book that doesn't praise the book, but shows you know what you're doing, like what genre it is, what books it's similar to, and then you send 3 chapters. But it really depends on what the agent asks for on their website. But that's how you start, and you submit to several agents at a time, because you're going to get most people will get a few rejections before you get an agent, and that's okay. That's just the way it works, and you don't take it personally.
Thank you.
So, one line in the Golden State reads, "History was not made of facts set in stone, but of the stories we tell." So, what was your thought process behind this statement, and how does it ring true for you?
Will you read the sentence again?
Yeah. So, I'm sorry. One line in Golden State reads, "History is made not of facts set in stone, but of the stories we tell." So, what was your thought process behind that?
Well, I remember the line, and I'm trying to remember where it happens in the novel. But I think that's sort of a thread through all of my books, is that our life, and especially in an earlier book, No One You Know, and I think I was carrying it through that book, that our lives are informed, like we have these actual events that happen, actual things we do. And then we have these stories that we tell ourselves about our lives. And we're all, to some extent, an unreliable narrator of our own history. And sometimes we tell these stories to make ourselves feel better, and sometimes we're very cruel to ourselves in the stories we tell. And all of these have an impact on what happens next. So that's on a personal level. But then on a broader level, and obviously we see this now, we have stories that are told globally or nationally, and you have a war happening in Ukraine where, and I'm not getting political here, there's a war happening where there's a certain set of facts that is brutal and horrible, but you have a lot of people in an invading country who have been told a certain story so loudly for so long that they don't. For them, the facts aren't set in stone. And I think we see this in our personal lives, and we see it on the broader level every day, all the time, but sometimes it's more apparent and more in our faces than others.
Yeah, I love the idea that we're an unreliable narrator in our own lives. Thank you.
Okay, so we've heard that a lot of authors actually completely refuse to read reviews on their own books.
They're lying.
Okay, I was gonna say, I
Not
don't know if I
true.
could. So you do?
Oh yeah, all of them. Okay. Well, I don't read all the Amazon. Was there more of the question? I don't mean to cut you out. Oh, okay. Yeah. I don't it's not when I first started, yes, I religiously read every Amazon review, and I don't do that now, but I do check up on them occasionally. Now there's Goodreads, so it's not possible to read all the reviews because there's just tens of thousands and you can't read all of them. But I definitely read all newspaper reviews. I read all the trade publication reviews because Kirkus and Publishers Weekly and Library Journal, Book List, these all come out before your book comes out. So of course you read them to see what they're saying before your book comes out, because you want to sort of see how your book is being received by the critics. But then, now I've been doing this for so long that so usually with critical reviews, as long as the balance of them is good, I don't mind one really negative review. At the beginning, that was harder. But what I love is I love the Goodreads and Amazon reviews. I love the good ones, of course. I love the super thoughtful ones. But now I get a little thrill out of 1-star reviews that say things like, "This is the worst book I have ever read in my life. I will never read anything this author writes ever again." And I just try to picture someone taking the time to sit down and write that, and I get sort of a little please don't do that, by the way. Don't do that. But I do, it's more amusing that, in the beginning that would have devastated me, but now that's kind of funny. But all writers read their reviews, and if they tell you they never read their reviews, then they have a island they can sell to you.
Okay, so do you read the reviews and ever take advice from them, or let that change your perspective of your novels, or you just kind of look at them?
It doesn't really it's not that I often read a review and think, okay, that's a good point, definitely, but it doesn't change the way I write, because there's no book that's right for every person. And you know that when you write, and when a critic gets a book, if they don't like it, they might have some valid points about it, but it also might not be the book for them. So yeah, it doesn't change the writing itself.
Okay, thank you.
So I know you said we would see Lena Connerly again, but did you think about writing a sequel for any of your other books?
Yes. So when I wrote The Marriage Pact, I thought that I would write a sequel for that, and I haven't done it. And then I switched publishers, so it's kind of complicated to do a sequel. Although I might still do a sequel for that in the UK, where I could just do it with the same publisher. But and The Year of Fog, I also thought, and I even started a sequel. But I just didn't get very far. Nothing came of it, and now I think it's probably too far from that original publication to write that sequel. But I think my books are all standalone. But for some reason with Lena, I just thought she could take us through a couple more adventures, so that's why I decided to do that with her.
Thank you.
Mentioning Lena and your feelings that, she can carry a few more novels and has more to explore. If you could meet any of your characters from any of your books in real life, who would it be?
Well, that is really hard. Let me think about it. I don't know. Maybe they're all so odious I wouldn't want to know them. I guess, I don't know, I think back to a guy named Nick in Know When You Know, and I'm not sure why that's the person I would want to meet, but for some reason, he helps the narrator out of a bad situation, so I think of him. But, so many of most of the main characters are actually influenced by someone I do know, so maybe that's why nothing comes to mind immediately, because I already know them.
And then Laura had mentioned earlier the quote from Golden State about stories and the role they play in our lives. And you've actually published a couple of short story collections, and you received the Truman Capote Prize in 2018 for your excellence in short story writing. We were kind of wondering, how has the role of short story writing developed in your career and creative process over the years?
So I started writing short stories because in the MFA program, that's sort of what you concentrate on. Although looking back, I had started writing short stories before I was in an MFA program. So I guess I was probably just drawn to them. And through my first MFA, maybe a year and a half, I didn't think that a novel was something that I could do. It seemed too hard or something, but stories are equally hard. So I think, I'm just trying to remember. So I think when my first book came out, my story collection, I was working on a novel at that time, but it's sort of the natural progression at the beginning of your career that you've written several stories, you've placed them in literary magazines, and then you go out with those stories as a collection. And then after the Year of Fog, I got sucked up in publishing contracts. So always had a novel due. And so writing a story would be fun. So I write stories for fun, and I would maybe place them in a literary magazine. I enjoyed doing it, but every time I wrote a story, I felt like I was cheating on my novel, and I felt like my publisher was breathing down my neck because I knew they wouldn't publish my stories, and they wouldn't. And I thought, okay, I gotta finish the novel. So writing stories was joyful because it was, and still is, it was like that early period of my career when I had little expectation of publishing. It was just writing for the love of it, and stories are still that way for me. And there's still more a sense of discovery with a story than a novel. And so I continue to write stories. I don't have enough to put together a collection yet, but hopefully I'll do that again before too long.
So what advice do you have to authors for creating a brand and an audience?
I'm not sure I'm the right person to ask. Someone who was a student came up to me and said she had seen my Instagram, and I haven't put anything on my Instagram, I think, in months. So I probably don't know the most about an author brand. What I do know is that when readers email me, I try to write back to them, and I try to put a lot of trust in my reader and think that, okay, if somebody read my last book and liked it, that even if this book seems to be a wild departure from that book, they're still going to read it. And I just sort of trust that readers are willing to take those leaps. I don't think I've been great at doing a brand. I mean, the easy thing is, I remember back in the day, which you guys don't remember, when you had to build a website with HTML. I built my own website, and it was a very clunky machine, and it's probably still clunky, but at least it's WordPress. So I think part of it for me is just sort of always keeping that up to date. But I do all these other things like write essays, and I started a Substack. So like I've been writing for that. And I guess that's part of the brand is just, sort of being careful about what you put out in public. And I didn't grow up putting stuff out, so I've been lucky that way. I think it's much, much harder for this generation because by the time you go out for your first job or to publish your first book, there is a vast library of you accessible to anyone on the internet, and people my age did not have to deal with that. But I do try to be less than creating a brand is just trying to, there's a private life and there's a public life, and to them not to cross too much.
Yeah, that's good advice actually for a lot of us.
Okay, so you recently spent a few years living in Paris, is that correct? I'm so jealous. Please take me with you next time. And correct me if I'm wrong, you're writing a memoir and a novel set in Paris right now?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so did you learn anything about your writing and yourself while you lived there that you think is going to kind of reflect in your novel and your memoir?
I learned I'm easily distractible. I learned that no matter where you put me, I would rather sit inside with my book and read. I learned that when you can't get a good burrito, all you want is a good burrito. But yeah, so the next Lena Connerly novel is set in Paris, and I'm writing sort of this collection of essays, working title Last Days in Paris. And I'm not sure what it will end up being ultimately, but I mean, I think what happened when I went there is I started this kind of writing that I used to do, that I used to love, that I, for the reasons I've explained about contracts, hadn't given myself the time to write. And I thought, okay, I'm not going to be in Paris that long. It's just a few years, and I better get some writing out of it while I'm here. So I allowed myself to just really sort of record impressions, street names, daily activities that I wouldn't normally write down. And now I'm going back and sort of mining that material to create the essays. And one thing that I learned from this that I would actually encourage all of you to do, I haven't really journaled much since I was much younger, but if you sit down and write sort of short form about your days, wherever you are, like just little pieces, give yourself a paragraph a day. Then when you look back at it later, you will see a narrative develop about your own life, which whether you want to publish it or not, all those things that happen to you that you think, oh, I could never forget, I promise you're going to forget them. And even if you have pictures of them on social media, yes, you'll remember the place. But there's little details you're not going to remember about your life that you actually really would be nice to have those things. So I would recommend just writing a few sentences a day about something you noticed that day or something that happened.
Okay, thank you.
I think we're right at the sort of end point there, but I did want to ask if anybody in the audience would like to ask a question. Yes, go ahead.
So the question for anyone who didn't hear it, and I'll paraphrase, is why did you decide to go to Paris? Was it to put yourself in a new place? Was it for the purpose of writing? Was it to experience something new? And the beginning of your question, was it an experiment? And I will say, yes, it was an experiment and possibly a failed one. I felt that I was my husband and I looking at our lives, we realized we only lived 2 years in New York City, but it was such every place that you live is a different spot on your timeline of your life. And we had lived in the Bay Area for 18 years, and it was all starting to run together. And we thought, okay, let's shake it up. Well, he had his job wanted to send him to Paris. He was working in Paris a lot anyway, and traveling there a lot. And so we had an opportunity to go through his work to Paris, and we loved our life in California. But we thought, when we look back, we'll regret not doing something different. And we knew that if we go there, we'll have like a little different piece of our life, and we'll look back and it will be an outsized chunk of our life because it's such a different place. And we also wanted our son to experience living abroad. We wanted him to experience that ease of waking up in one country one morning and without too much thought being in a completely different country the next morning, which I think is a really valuable experience for anyone to have. So I didn't go there to write, but I went there thinking, when I get there, I better write, and I'm going to write something different because I'm there. So it was a work thing, but it was also a life choice. So, you're welcome.
Do you want to mention to them real quick about the pandemic?
Oh, right, the pandemic. Okay, so we get to Paris in August. In September, the Yellow Vest protest started. And I don't know if you guys heard about this over here, but we had tear gas coming through our windows. We had cars burning on our street. It was crazy for 8 months of Saturdays, but we quickly learned the Parisians only protest on Saturdays, so come Sunday morning, you're fine and you can leave your apartment. But immediately after the Yellow Vest protests stopped, well, the Yellow Vests and then the biggest transit strikes in 50 years, and then all of a sudden the pandemic hit. So, and we were put on a serious lockdown, and I know there was lockdowns everywhere, but in Paris, we could only walk 1 kilometer from our apartment, and you couldn't leave the city, you couldn't drive anywhere, you were just, you could go out for 1 hour a day with paperwork and your identity, and I was stopped by a Parisian cop on a horse on the Champs when I was walking within my kilometer, and had to give him my papers and was trying to explain what, as an American who clearly didn't speak very good French, I was doing there. And it was just a strange time to be in Paris, but it was also beautiful to see that city completely empty and to walk down Avenue Hoche, this grand boulevard, and not a single other person there. And I'll end with one odd little story. It was at the beginning of lockdown, and I was walking down Avenue FDR to get to a grocery store, but it was late at night, and there was no one on the street. And a man walks up to me, and he's holding this pole. They had just initiated the 6-foot distance rule, and he held out this pole, and he said in French, we can talk if you hold this pole, because it was 6 feet apart. I was like, I'm so, désolé, my French is very bad. And also I was nervous about talking to anyone, so I hurried on my way. But it was just one of the details of the oddities of life in that particular city at that particular time.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much. And we look forward to both the memoir and the novel about Paris. I want to thank you guys for all coming this morning. And let's give a round of applause both to our interviewers, who are very relieved right now, and one more round of applause for our 2022 recipient of the Hall Water Prize, Michelle Richmond.